Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. So my name is Tyler, I'm part of the business development team here at Rangle, and I'm joined by Thomas, he's one of our software developers. So I'm just going to be doing a really quick intro on who Rangle is as a company and how we work with our partners, and then I'm going to hand it off to Thomas to do the rest of the presentation. So Rangle.io is a JavaScript specialist firm. We're the leading experts in Angular, React, and cross-platform mobile apps. We use rapid lean development practices to build software powered by user insights and analytics. We've been around for about 3.5 years now, and in that time we've completed more than 90 client projects. We currently have more than 100 developers and designers and a total staff of about 160, all working from our office here in downtown Toronto. Rangle.io as a company has remained super focused on next generation front-end web and mobile products, and that's allowed us to really become the best at what we do. We've approached that we call Rangle Flow. It's essentially a mix of Scrum, Lean UX, test-driven development, and continuous integration and deployment. Our clients will always have complete visibility into the projects, allowing them to validate direction, lower risk, and get products to market faster. Ideally, we'll even integrate with members of a client's team to help ensure knowledge transfer during the development process. So I believe Thomas will touch more on BML during his presentation, but I think it's important to emphasize that a lot of Wrangle's success has come from our commitment to following the lean principles. So our services kind of fall into 3 buckets, the first being building. So that's where we'll put together a Scrum team based on the needs of your project, usually consisting of developers, designers, Scrum masters, and business quality analysts. These teams can be used to increase velocity of a project, build a greenfield application, or really anything in between. Whoops, not yet. The second is training. We do training for React and Angular. It's a hands-on keyboard style training where you actively work on code snippets opposed to just hearing somebody stand at the front of a class lecturing. And the third bucket is consulting. So these are usually shorter term engagements where one of our support squad members will come in. They'll work with your team to make sure you're following best practices and help you remove any roadblocks or issues you may be facing. So our client type is really quite broad. We've worked with everyone from Fortune 100 companies to 2-person startups, and kind of will work with anybody that has needs in our expertise. So if you have any questions about Rangle and how we work after the presentation, I'll be around to answer them for you. Until then, I'm going to pass things off to Thomas to dive into the wonderful world of analytics. Thomas?
Thank you. So I'm going to start this webinar off by talking about what analytics is. I'm going to define it. Then I'm going to introduce a process that we can follow to get the most out of analytics. And I'm going to show you I'm going to talk about 3 real-world examples of that process in action. And then after that, I'm going to talk about the things that you need to know when you're adding analytics to your single-page application. So what you have to watch out for. I'm going to describe the best way that we do it here at Rangle. Then I'm going to give you a demonstration. I built a single-page application. I'm going to show you how it works. I'm going to show you the type of analytics reports that we're able to generate from that demo. I'm going to introduce a new open-source software library that we built called Redux Beacon, and I'll show you how that works too. I'm going to finish off by talking about some reporting services and some management tools that'll help you get started with analytics. This is just going to be a small sample of tools. It is by no means the only tools out there. There are tons of tools out there. I'm going to talk about Google Analytics. I'm going to talk about Adobe Analytics, which is part of Adobe Marketing Cloud. I'm going to talk about Google Tag Manager, and I'm going to talk about Segment.io. So in this first part, I'm going to try and answer the question, how can we use analytics to improve our product development process? Analytics is basically information that you get from looking at and analyzing data. So you collect data, and you analyze it, and you get some insights, some information from that data. It's not enough to just look at the data, collect it, and get some insight from it. You have to have a process in place to get value out of that data. Most people know that process as BML, build, measure, learn. So it's a 3-step process. You build something, it could be an MVP, it could be a new design, it could be a new feature, and then you ship it out to your users, and you see how your users are responding to that thing that you built, whether it be an MVP, a minimal viable product, a new design, or a new feature. And then you learn from that. You learn from the way your users are responding to the things that you built. And you follow that process round and round in the pursuit of understanding your users and in the pursuit of building a better product. The BML process is basically a branded form of the scientific method. And I'm going to focus today on talking about how we can use the scientific method to build better products. So I'm going to look at 3 case studies. on how to use the scientific method to build a better product. So what is the scientific method? It's a simple 4-step process. You have an observation, you're a scientist, you're walking in a garden, and you see an apple fall from a tree. Then the second step, you have this idea, this hypothesis. Maybe the same force that draws the apple towards the ground is the same force that draws the tides to and from the shore. And then you or one of your colleagues builds out an experiment, and this experiment is supposed to be designed in a way that tests your hypothesis. So the experiment is built out to test your ideas. You build out the experiment, you conduct this experiment, and you don't just walk away, you collect data on that experiment, you measure. You measure that data, you analyze the data, and you see if that data validates your hypothesis. You see if the data verifies your idea. It may verify your idea, it may not verify idea, but either way you're going to learn something and you're going to publish something. So scientists go around all these 4 steps in the pursuit of understanding the universe, and we can go around these 4 steps in the pursuit of understanding our users. Or more specifically, we can go around these steps in the pursuit of understanding how our users are responding to our MVP, how our users are responding to our new designs, how our users are responding to our new features. So like I mentioned before, we're going to look at 3 short case studies. The first is going to be about an entrepreneur who built a billion-dollar business using the scientific method. Then we're going to talk about a UX designer who is working at an e-commerce site, and she uses the scientific method to validate her design decisions and improve conversions in the site. Then we're going to finish off with the case study on an engineer who's building out a site with her friends, and she uses the scientific method to fight feature creep. And I'm going to talk a bit more about what feature creep is when I get to that case study. So this first case takes place in San Francisco, California, 7 years ago. It's 2010, with 2 guys, Kyle Systrom and Mike Krieger. These guys, they're sitting in a bar, and they have this idea, this observation that there's this new technology out there. It's called HTML5. They're really excited about it because it'll allow them, they think, to build web apps for a mobile platform for smartphones that give a good experience. So back in the day, if you wanted to build something for a smartphone, you'd have to use a native platform, you'd have to build something specifically for iOS, you'd have to build something specifically for Android, and they thought this new technology would let them build out an application that would work seamlessly on Android as it does on iOS. So they had that observation, and then they come up with this idea. We want to build something like Foursquare, which at the time was only a native application. We want to build something like Foursquare, but instead of as a native application, we want to build it as a web app. So Foursquare is a simple idea. Say you're going out with your friends, you go out to have a coffee, you go out to the movies, you go out to a concert. This app, when you're at that place, when you're at the coffee shop, when you're at the concert, when you're at the movies, you would log into the app, you'd bring out your smartphone, and you'd check in and let your friends know where you were at. They also had this optional feature, which was where you could take a snap, take a picture of where it was that you were, and you could take a picture of who you were with and share that with your friends. So a simple web app like Foursquare, you can check in when you're going places, and you can take pictures of the places that you're at. So they pitched that idea to some investors, and they built out this web app, and they called that web app Bourbon. And Mike and Kyle were both pretty smart kids. They're both Stanford graduates, and they were smart enough to not just build out this MVP and ship it out and then see what happens. They wanted to see specifically, they wanted to measure how people were using Bourbon. They wanted to know exactly the features that people were using. They wanted to see the features that people weren't using, and they wanted to get insight, get a window into the way people were using Bourbon. So they added some code to collect analytics, and they shipped it out, and after a few weeks, they analyzed the data, and they learned something. They learned that most of the people weren't really worried, weren't really using the main feature of their application, which was checking in. People weren't going to places, they weren't checking in. Most people were going out of their way to use this optional feature, which was sharing photos. So people weren't caring about this main feature of checking in, people were only worried about sharing photos. And they really liked the sharing photos. So they got together with this new insight, with this information, and they decided that it wasn't worth it to maintain all this functionality for checking in. So they decided to build out an entirely new application that's solely focused on this one thing, this one feature, and that feature was to share photos. So they spent a couple of weeks, and they built out a company called Instagram. It was really successful. 2 years later, it got really popular, and Facebook bought it for $1 billion. So imagine how the story would have gone if they hadn't had the foresight to add analytics to Bourbon. If they hadn't had the foresight to add analytics to their MVP. They would have had the same observation, which was that HTML5 is great. They would have the same hypothesis, which was that something like Foursquare but a web app would be great. They would have had the same experiment, which was Bourbon, except this time Bourbon wouldn't collect any analytics, and they wouldn't have been able to answer the question, are people using every feature in Bourbon? And Bourbon probably would have failed, and Instagram probably wouldn't exist. So that was just a short case study on how this couple of entrepreneurs use the scientific method, knowing or unknowing, to build a better product. This next case study is about a UX designer instead. So this UX designer, she's in Seattle, Washington, and she's starting a new job at this e-commerce site. It's a big, mature e-commerce site, and she's looking through the site, looking for things that she can improve, looking for things that she can suggest in her design meetings. So she has this observation one day. She noticed that their Buy Now button on their site, it's gray, and she hates it. She doesn't like the color gray. She thinks it doesn't drive action. The Buy Now button is probably the most valuable, the most important button on their site, and people aren't seeing it. She thinks people aren't seeing it. And she has this idea that if the button were a brighter color, if it popped out of the page, then more people would click on it, they get more conversions, and they drive up revenue. So she says enough is enough. She goes down to the engineering department. She finds an engineer that can help her out with this new experiment, this idea that she has. She wants to bring it to life. And they work for a couple of hours together, and they built out this new Buy Now button component. She's really excited about it. She's really happy with the results. She's happy with the engineer's work. So she asks him, how can we get this in the hands of our users? How can we get people looking at this new Buy Now button instead of the gray button? Who do I need to talk to? Who needs to sign off on this decision? So he explains to her, okay, we have this process at this e-commerce site where whenever we have a new design change, what we'll do is we'll ship that new design to only a small sample of users. So they'll ship it out to a few thousand users in a few different locations. And then we'll see how people are responding to that change, and then we'll reconvene in a couple weeks once we have enough data, and then we'll see whether or not we should make this a permanent design change, and we'll see what we learned from it. And she says, okay, that's great. It sucks that we couldn't get it out today, but it's great that we may be able to get it out in a few weeks. So a few weeks go by, and the engineer calls a meeting with the designer, and he shows her, he brings out his analytics reporting tool, and he shows her that, for every 1,000 people that saw the gray button, only one person would click on it, only one person would buy something. And for every 1,000 people with her design, 10 people would click on it. So they increased conversions 10 times. And that day, they learned that orange is better than gray. And then she went on to update the style guide, and they made sure that every call to action in their site was a brighter color instead of a muted gray color. So imagine what this would have looked like if they hadn't had that process in place to measure how people were responding to the design changes. That she would have had the same observation that gray doesn't drive action. She would have had the same hypothesis that a brighter color would be better. She would have had the same experiment, that orange Buy Now button, but she wouldn't have been able to answer the question, does a brighter button color improve conversions? She wouldn't have any hard data on that decision, and they wouldn't have learned that orange is better than gray, and they'd run the risk of having call to actions throughout their site that aren't brighter colors. And this can be, a designer can use this method for anything as simple as a button color to anything as complicated as an entire user flow. So this last case study, rather than a designer, we're talking about an engineer, and she's in Phoenix, Arizona, and she's starting a startup with one of her friends, actually a group of her friends, and their startup is a simple web app where you upload an image to this web app, and you can make edits to that image. You can crop it, you can rotate it, you can update its opacity, you can add meme text to it if you want. And she has this observation one day as she's working on her site, and that observation is that she's trying to rotate an image, and right now the only way that they can do that in the site is to type in the degrees to rotate the image by. And she just wants a rough way to do this. She doesn't want to rotate. She doesn't want to know exactly what degree she wants to rotate it by. She just wants to skew it by a little bit. So she has this hypothesis, this idea. So she brings together her co-founders, her friends in a meeting room, and she presents them an idea. She says, I want to build out a radial slider, something that I can use to rotate an image without having to type anything in. I can just use my mouse and I can rotate the image roughly without knowing the exact degrees that I want to rotate the image by. And her friends, they're not buying it. They're a little reluctant. So she tells them, okay, it's fine. You don't want to worry about maintenance costs. You don't want to worry about this. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll build this out in the weekend, and we'll start collecting analytics on this thing that I built, this radio slider. We'll ship it out right next to the info box, and we'll measure of the people that are rotating an image. We'll collect data on how many people are using the info box instead of the radio slider. So she does that. Her friends agree that that's like a totally reasonable thing to do. So she works on the weekend, she builds out the radio slider, and she adds code in to measure whether or not people are using this instead of the info box. A couple of weeks go by, and she brings her friends together, and they look at the analytics reporting tool in a meeting room, and they find out that for every 10 person that would rotate an image, only 1 would use her new feature, her radio slider, instead of the info box. So her hypothesis was wrong. She thought more people would use it, but she still learned something. She still learned that people don't find the radio slider useful. And now, imagine how this would have gone if her friends hadn't nudged her to go further and to collect analytics on this. She would have had the same observation that the input box isn't great. She would have the same hypothesis that a radio slider would be better. She would have had the same experiment, except this time, rather than collecting data on the input box and the radio slider, those 2 features, she wouldn't have it. She wouldn't have been able to ask the question, do people find the radio slider useful? And she wouldn't have learned that people don't find the radio slider useful. So this is really important, because if you're starting a business and you're not sure what features your users want, if you're just shotgunning it, if a feature idea comes to your mind and you're just putting it in the web app hoping that someone will like it, that could be detrimental, because each line of code has a dollar cost to it, not just in the time it takes to build it, but in the time that it takes to maintain it in the long term. So if you have features that people aren't using, it's dragging your business down. You're not getting a good return on those features because people aren't using it, people aren't getting value out of it, and you're putting money into maintaining it. So hopefully at this point, after we looked at the 3 case studies, it's a little bit more obvious that product development doesn't make a whole lot of sense without analytics. So maybe ask yourself, how can you learn how your users are responding to your MVP, your design change, your new features without analytics? How can you measure the success of your work without analytics? And most importantly, if you're a business owner, how can you afford not having analytics? How can you afford to spend money building out a feature, building out a set of features, building out a new design, building out an MVP without measuring your success, without measuring whether or not you're getting a good return on investment? So I just tried to answer the question, how can we use analytics to improve our product development process? I described the scientific method. We looked at those 3 stories, those 3 case studies. We sort of tried to frame the idea that analytics is really important in the product development process. Now I'm going to talk about what are the things you need to watch out for when you're collecting analytics in your single-page applications. I'm going to talk about the difference between collecting analytics in a single-page app and the difference between collecting analytics in a traditional website. So a lot of these analytics services like Google Analytics, Adobe Analytics, they came out at a time when traditional single-page apps weren't really a thing. Most websites on the web were traditional websites where each change in the app was caused by a page load. So let's say you had a site, mysite.com. That site had 3 pages. It had a pie page that showed a pie chart, had a line page that showed a line chart, had a bar page that showed a bar chart. And each time you go from page to page, each time you navigate throughout that site, the browser would look at the route, look at the URL in the address bar, and it would request all the resources required to load that page from the site. So you'd get a page load for each different page that you went to caused a page load. So analytics tools, this is what you want to track in analytics. You want to track the things that your users are doing to change the user interface. So whenever a change happens, that's something that you can track in analytics. And these analytics services at this time, they knew that, and so they're geared towards sites where everything is caused by a page load. The problem arises when you have a single-page app because there's only ever one page load. So if you have mysite.com, the same site, except this time it's a single-page app, you can have the same 3 pages, except this time when you go from page to page, you're not getting a full page load. JavaScript is controlling what gets displayed dynamically rather than requesting resources from the server over and over again. It may request smaller resources, but in a nutshell, there's only one page load in a single page app. And that's an issue because you want to track those things in analytics. You want to track when people go from page to page. And these services, they're not designed for that. So if you want to track these things in a single page application, you have to use JavaScript. You have to do everything manually. You have to tell using their JavaScript APIs, you have to tell these APIs that you are moving from a pie page to a line page to a bar page. And this is where things get hairy, because whenever you add JavaScript to an app, whether it be for collecting analytics or whether it be for doing a feature, you have to be careful, because there are lots of things that can slow you down. So when you add JavaScript to a site, you have to watch for technical debt. You have to watch for context switching. You have to watch for introducing poor architectures. You have to watch for having a poor process, because if you have a poor process, it's going to slow you down. There are lots of things that can speed you up. So you have test-driven development, continuous integration, continuous delivery, automation, good process, Scrum, feature toggles. So all these things can speed up your process, and there's also a lot of things that can slow down your process if you're adding analytics to your site, if you're adding JavaScript to your site in a way that introduces technical debt, that introduces poor architectures. So I'm going to talk specifically about how we at Rangle add analytics. We collect analytics in our single-page applications without introducing technical debt, without introducing poor architectures. Most of our single-page apps at Rangle, whether it be React or Angular, we use a global state management tool or an architecture, an idea called Redux, or the Angular form called NGRX Store. It's a very simple, very popular architecture for designing user interfaces. You have a user action, and it goes as a little pocket of data. It goes as a string to Redux, and then Redux or NGRX Store decides what the next state of the application is going to look like. So let's say you're typing something in on your keyboard, you press the letter A, that's the user action, that comes up as a little packet of data. It goes up towards Redux, and then Redux looks at that packet of data, and it decides what the next state of the application is going to look like. So in this case, the next state of the application is going to be that a letter A gets displayed in this input box. And it can be something as simple as entering a letter A in the input box to whatever else you need to do in your app. So any change that happens goes through Redux. Anything that the user does to change the state of the UI goes through Redux. And that's really powerful, because those are the types of things that we want to track in analytics. So before, in a traditional website, every change would be a page load, and now every change is Redux. So what we've been able to do at Rangle is we built out some middleware called Redux Beacon. It's a tool, and it sits between that user action, and it sits between that user action and Redux, and it listens to all those user actions that are happening, everything that's changing the state of the UI, and it's looking at those packets of data, and it's asking, is this packet of data something that I want to track? Is it something that I need to track? Did somebody click the buy now button? Did somebody use the photo sharing utility? Did somebody use the check-in utility? Did somebody use this radio slider instead of the input box? And if that answer is yes, if it's something that you want to track, then Redux Beacon is going to create an analytics event, and it's going to send it off to a given target. So it's going to send it off to a service that you're going to use, whether it be Segment.io, Google Tag Manager's data layer, Google Analytics, or Amplitude, or a custom target if you want. So if you have your own IBM digital analytics servers running in your company's building, then you can send it there if you want. So now I'm going to show you a demonstration. I'm going to bring up a single-page application. I'm going to briefly go over what this app does. It's designed using Redux. It's designed using React and Redux Beacon. So I'm going to show you what it does. I'm going to show you the types of analytics that we're able to track. And just keep in mind that there's only one page load, and that's at the beginning. So I'm going to switch over to this app. It's a very simple shopping cart type app. You can buy stuff, you can add stuff to your cart. So you have, here you're buying, NASA space shuttle missions. Sorry, not space shuttle, NASA missions. You can get a couple Hubbles for 14 billion, some Cassinis for 3.3 billion, and some cheap Curiosities for a few more. So you add them, you have 10 missions in your cart, and then you can go to view your cart. You got 3 Hubbles at 14 billion, 3 Cassinis at 3.3 billion, 4 Curiosities at 2.6 billion for a very affordable $62.3 billion. And then you go to checkout. And once you check out, you can enter in your payment information. So you can enter in your name, John Smith, your email, john.smith@gmail.com, your telephone number, and your credit card number. And you can click Buy Now and order success. You're poor. Okay, so what type of analytics can we track using this? So keep in mind that, I don't know if you noticed, but each time, whenever we move from page to page, the route was changing, but there was no full page load. The browser didn't refresh. So normally we wouldn't be able to track that, but because we're using Redux and Redux Beacon, we can track that very, very easily. So this is some analytics that we're tracking. And let me just change the view to the last 30 days. And let's go to real-time view. Hopefully it shows us online. So it shows us that we have one person online, and we can see that in the last 30 minutes, we went to a cart page, we went to order complete page, we went to a payment page, we went to all these pages, and we didn't have a single page load. And this is really cool because that means that we don't have to have, we can have one page load, but we can still use Google Analytics just like we used to use it when we use traditional websites. So we can develop things like goals and funnel reports. And I'll show you one funnel report that we built out. So this funnel report has one goal, and that goal is to test the fallout from people that added something to their cart to the people that bought it. So we want to see how many people added something to their cart, and we want to see how many people bought something, and we want to see where they dropped off. So we have 24 people added something to their cart, 4 dropped off, 20 people viewed the cart, 20 people made it to the payment form, but 9 dropped off there. And so only 11 people ordered something. So of the 24 people that added something to their cart, only 11 people bought something. And say you want to drill down deeper, you want to see where exactly are people dropping off in the payment form page. So I'll just go back to here. So say you want to track, you want to know how many people filled in their name, you want to know how many people filled in their email, you want to know how many people filled in their credit card and their telephone number, and how many people tried to buy something but couldn't because of a validation error. So let's see a funnel report of that. Let's see. So here we have a funnel report. We have the number of people that viewed the form, 21. 2 people dropped off at this point. So 2 people looked at the payment form. They were like, no way, and they dropped off. 19 people entered in a name, no problem. 19 people entered in an email. 17, so 2 people dropped off from here. Some people don't like phone numbers, so they didn't want to enter in their phone number. 3 dropped off here. So 3 people dropped off because they didn't want to enter in their credit card number. So only 14 people entered in the credit card number. That looks to be our biggest drop. And 14 people tried to buy something, and 10 people filled out the payment form. So we have buy now attempted. That's an interesting step because we can actually track when people clicked on this buy now button but couldn't finish that order because they didn't have a valid email. So those are things that we couldn't track because back in the day, everything was done using a page load. You could, if you want to use JavaScript, you have all this power that you can track whatever you want. You can see deeper into how your users are using your app. Awesome. So that was all built using Redux Beacon and Redux. Redux Beacon is free and open source software. It's released under the MIT license. Please check out the repository. It's on GitHub, github.com/Rangle/Redux Beacon, or you can just Google Redux Beacon docs. Redux Beacon is framework agnostic. It loves React, React Native, Angular, Vue. It works seamlessly with all of them. It also supports every analytics platform. So it doesn't matter what you're using, what service you're using, whether you're using Google Analytics, Adobe Analytics, Amplitude, Segment, doesn't matter. It supports it. Right now we have some pre-built targets that we support. We support Google Tag Manager, we maintain that. We maintain Google Analytics target, Amplitude, Segment, and that's it. And we have Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics for React Native too. One unique thing of Redux Beacon is it has offline event tracking. So say your user is using your app on their laptop or on the cell phone, they're on a train and they go through a tunnel, they lose connection. What would happen normally is that any analytics event that got captured when they were in the tunnel, when they didn't have a connection, it would get lost. But what Redux Beacon does is when you enable this functionality, it'll put all these events, all these analytics events into a bucket, and as soon as you regain connections, as soon as you regain a connection, it's going to take all those events from that bucket and it's going to send them off to a target. It's also very flexible and extensible. Building out a target for a new target, like a new service like IBM Digital Analytics, is very simple. There's documentation on how to do that. You can also build out custom offline event extensions, and you can build out custom extensions for logging. It's also on NPM, so please NPM install, save Redux Beacon. Let us know how you like it. Give us a star if you like it. If you have an idea for an enhancement, tweet me or make an issue on GitHub. So we just finished off, we answered the question, what are things that we need to know when collecting analytics in our apps? We discovered that Analytics services like page loads, because it helps us know when things change in a traditional website. We discovered that single page applications don't have page loads and that everything has to be done in JavaScript. And we talked about how we can add that JavaScript, how we can collect analytics with JavaScript without incurring technical debt, without incurring poor architectures, without spending a lot of time doing it. And before that, we talked about how we can use analytics to improve our product development process. So we looked at those 3 case studies, and we discussed the scientific method. Now I'm going to finish off by trying to answer the question, what analytics tools and platforms exist, and what are the pros and cons of each? So I'm going to look at a small sample of tools. I'm going to first start with Google Analytics and Adobe Analytics, and like I mentioned before, this is a very small, this is not an entire representation of what's out there. There are tons of tools out there. These are just the 2 that we've had experience with at Rangle. So Google Analytics, by far the most popular service out there. Excuse me. So we got Google Analytics, by far the most popular service out there. It has a good byproduct of this because there's a lot of people that specialize in Google Analytics, a lot of resources out there, a lot of blog posts are written in Google Analytics. There's a lot of companies that are built to serve people that use Google Analytics, and there's also a lot of tools out there that are catered towards Google Analytics. It's also free, so there is a paid version, but you really don't need to use the paid version unless you're at a really large size and you're using, you need dedicated technical support. It's also easy to set up, so if you want to do a demo or something, or if you want to get started with Google Analytics, all you have to do is sign up, log in, and you're good to go. We use Google Analytics when people aren't sure. When people don't have an analytics reporting tool, like a company comes to us and they don't have anything yet, we typically recommend Google Analytics because it's easy for them to set up and it's very risk-free. One thing that's sort of a downside with Google Analytics is it samples your data. So if you reach a large size and you have a lot of traffic coming to your site, what Google Analytics will do to speed things up is it'll take all that data and it'll look for a small sample, a small slice of that data that it thinks gives a good representation of the whole of that data. So it'll look at this whole chunk of data, it'll use an algorithm to find that smallest piece that gives a good idea of what the rest of the site, what the rest of the data looks like. And that's great when it works because it makes things more performant and faster, but it could lead to issues if that algorithm doesn't work well. If you have, it may lead to some errors. So you have to watch out for that if you reach a large size. Adobe Analytics is a more enterprise-ready version of Google Analytics, so it doesn't have a free version. It's not freemium. I'm sure they have a free trial, but you have to go through their sales team or their client services to get that. You can't just go in, log in, and get something. It's also very customizable, so this is as much an upside as it is a downside. When you go in, there's a little bit of an upfront cost because you have to customize the reporting tool to however you want to use it. But it's also good because if you want to have the reporting tool customized to your needs, what you want, what you like, what your team likes, you have the ability to do that. It doesn't sample data like Google Analytics does. It's a very good option, and a lot of our clients do use Adobe Analytics, which is part of Adobe Marketing Cloud. So now I'm going to talk about some analytics management tools. So these 2 tools are a little bit different than the last 2 in that they don't give you reports. So these are just things to help you manage your analytics in your team, manage your analytics platform. Google Tag Manager. So what is a tag? A tag is, like, say you sign up for Google Analytics, you sign up for one of these services, they're going to ask you to paste in a little snippet of JavaScript, a little piece of code in your index.html in your site, and with that code, it's going to track your analytics. So there was a problem with this method because marketers would want to try out different analytics services, and each analytics service would want that marketer to paste that code into their site. So they'd have all these tags in their site, and each time they wanted to do that, each time they wanted to add, remove, or disable tags, they would have to go through their engineering department. It's usually a different department. It could be a different country even, and it would take a lot of time. And sometimes they would, ask them to do it, and they would do it, and they find out that they don't like the service, so they just let it go stale, and it slows the site down. You'll end up having a site with tons of tags, tons of services loading, and you're only using part of it just because you don't want to go through the process of getting a developer to update the code base. So what Google Tag Manager does is it's a way to inject those scripts through a user interface. So what you do is you add in one Google Tag Manager tag to your site, and when your site loads, based on a configuration that you do using a user interface online, the marketer does this, those tags will load automatically by Google Tag Manager, and whatever analytics you track will get sent off there, and you can manage from this user interface which events get sent to which targets and when. It's free. There's no enterprise version as far as I know. It's free for everyone. There's very low barrier to entry, so there's no coding required. So a marketer can understand Google Tag Manager. All they need to know is a little bit of terminology, and they can get started. The biggest benefit for Google Tag Manager is that it decouples tracking and reporting. So this is great because it means that you can change the way your analytics is reported without having to change the way it's collected. So this is the main benefit of Google Tag Manager. It means you can have the same way of collecting data, and you can just change the way it's reported, to which service it's going to when it's going a certain service. It doesn't store your data. So Google Tag Manager, the data doesn't move from your app to Google Tag Manager to the service. The data just goes from your app directly to the service. All Google Tag Manager does is it provides rules for telling your app when to send an analytics event to a given service. One thing that I found about Google Tag Manager is that it's a bit difficult to debug. So it's just something that I found. Sometimes I don't know where the issue is, whether it's with my Google Tag Manager configuration, whether it's an issue with me pushing to the data layer, or whether it's an issue with something between Google Tag Manager and the service. That's just something. They have debugging tools out there for Google Tag Manager, but it's just something that I noticed is a bit hard, especially on mobile. So now I'm going to finish off by talking about Segment.io really briefly. It is a bit different than Google Tag Manager, but same idea. Its main benefit is to decouple tracking and reporting. You can think of Segment as a bucket where you can toss all your analytics events into. So you have an analytics event, it happens on your site, you put it into this bucket, and you apply rules to tell Segment what to do with this piece of data, how to transform it, and where to send it off to. It has a lot more destinations than Google Tag Manager does. Google Tag Manager is a bit biased towards Google products, whereas Segment has a bunch of destinations and places that you can send your analytics to, reporting tools. You can access your raw data. So you have a database that's managed by Segment that has all of your data, all your analytics data for your entire site throughout time. So you can do cool things like history, traversals, and time travel. It's also great on mobile. One of the downsides with Segment.io is that it stores data on your users. Segment.io could be bad for you because it does store your data and it maintains all that data throughout history. And if that's an issue with your company, that could be a deal breaker. So that's it. That's all I wanted to talk about today. We talked about how we can use analytics to improve our product development process, the 3 case studies, the scientific method. We talked about the things that we need to know when we're adding analytics to our single-page applications. We know that we're going to use Redux Beacon because it's going to make it easy, and we know basic sampling of some analytics tools that we can get started with. We know Google Analytics, Google Tag Manager. So that's it. That's all we had today. Are we going to ask questions now, or?
Yeah, we can take a quick look and see if there's any questions, and
Let's see.
If not, yeah, no, I think we're good. So
Awesome.
If you want to pop back to that last screen there really quickly, my information is there, as is Thomas's Twitter. So if you have any questions for us, feel free to reach out, and we'll make sure we hop on a call with you or answer anything via email that we can. And I think that's it. So thanks so much for hopping on. Have a good day.